Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, blue liquor shills, death slayers, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks, bankers come. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And let's go to the not so good old USA right now and look at the fact that the bank bailouts are still going on. It's been almost a decade since the collapse, in which the banks were almost entirely responsible for, and yet they're continuing to get bailed out. And this is because of the fact that the banks, when the collapse happened, the initial bailouts happened, the banks were allowed to park their excess reserves at the Federal Reserve and get paid interest on them. And so now here it is, almost a decade later, and they're still getting paid interest on these excess reserves parked at the Federal Reserve. And because of the way the Federal Reserve makes profits and then deposits these profits to the Treasury, the money ends up being put on the taxpayer. The taxpayer is put on the hook for the money that the banks are not paying. So anyway, let's get into the details of this. In 2016, the Federal Reserve paid banks $12 billion in interest on excess reserves, and they have almost $2 trillion parked at the Federal Reserve. And of course, this has a direct relation to the federal interest rates. And the federal interest rates in December 2015 bumped them up from 0.25% to 0.5%. And it seems like a small amount, but it has huge effects. And in this case, it makes the effects being money paid to the banks. And of course, if you look back over the last 10 years, let's just use that round number, 10 years since the collapse. And if they've been making $12 billion in interest in a year, then we're talking definitely around $100 billion. So think about that. Supposedly the economy's recovered, supposedly the banks have recovered, and yet the Federal Reserve is still paying interest on these excess reserves to the Federal Reserve, and they've gotten over $100 billion in free money from the Federal Reserve over the last 10 years. And that is money that the taxpayers eventually are on the hook for. So that's another $100 billion bank bailout. Like I say, if the banks have recovered, and the economic recovery is in, then it's about time to get the Federal Reserve to get these banks off the government tit. So how it works is that the Fed gets interest. They have $2.46 trillion in treasuries that they bought, so they're single-handedly one of the biggest buyers of U.S. treasuries, and they're parked there, so that distorts the market. And then we have $1.74 trillion in mortgage-backed securities that they nicely took off the balance sheets of all the banks. And so a staggering amount, $2 trillion in mortgage-backed securities were parked at the Federal Reserve so that the banks don't have to eat their own shit. How about that? And so then December 2015, the Fed raised the interest rate on reserves, like I mentioned, and that way they still get a fair amount of money each year. And if the Federal Reserve rate keeps getting bumped up over the next couple of years, then obviously they're going to be making a lot more money. And there doesn't seem to be any move right now to get the banks off of this tit. The Federal Reserve is a nanny for the too big to fail banks on Wall Street. So the Fed deducts the $12 billion from the amount it pays the Treasury, and then the U.S. government gets $12 billion less in revenue. And that's how the taxpayers are put on the hook for this. So I don't know about you. You know, a lot of people think, oh, well, the bailouts were 10 years ago, and it was only $750 billion, and all that got paid back. Well, first of all, not all of it got paid back. And second of all, the bank bailouts are actually in the order of tens of trillions of dollars in secret loans done for all these too big to fail banks. And now, of course, it turns out the bank bailouts are just a continuing, ongoing process. And I don't know about you, but I'm pretty pissed off about it. I'm Useful Idiot. Don't you be one too.